Welcome to Kronos Talks, a place for some candid thoughts on what might need to change if we're going to get the world's sustainable finance and corporate sustainability to generate positive impacts. I'm Gemma James, Kronos' head of Biodiversity Nature, and this is the first in a series of 3 podcasts talking to some of our nature and biodiversity team about their areas of specialism. So first up, it's Laura Fox, who is an agriculture and biodiversity manager here at Kronos. She's an expert on agriculture and previously of Flora and Fauna International. And she also recently helped with the research for a book, Just Earth, with Tony Juniper. And I might also note that that is now available on the shelves. Laura, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Gemma. Really good to be here.
So today our topic is regenerative agriculture. And before we get into what is regenerative agriculture and how it's being used, Laura, how did you get interested in regenerative agriculture and what's your background on it?
So regenerative agriculture wasn't a term in use when I became interested in farming and agriculture really about 30 years ago. I was really interested in land and resource conflict and worked in India for 6 months before university with smallholder farmers and shepherds on a reforestation project. And from that, I realised how much was expected of that group of farmers and really receiving very little visible support at that time. And that triggered my interest in agriculture and farming. And then from then, my career has been working with smallholder farmers to help them meet their immediate needs and balancing that off against the expectations of corporates and supply chains and conservation organisations and governments, etc. And since then, I've been able to work on a whole range of different aspects of agriculture from within a conservation organisation, looking at topics such as tackling the drivers of deforestation, which is essentially social and economic systems for farming communities in and around protected areas, looking at different conservation agricultural techniques, including things like climate smart agriculture. And then at the latter end, I also worked on a RED project where the primary driver of deforestation within that landscape was smallholder cropping systems, where the farmers would rotationally burn the land to clear it for farming. But these were old family plots that had been scattered through the landscape, and they might not go back to them for sort of, 30, 40 years. So at that point, there would be quite developed secondary growth forest there. So it was supporting these farmers to move to a fixed farming system to try and increase the forest cover in the landscape, because unfortunately for this group of farmers in Liberia, the areas that they had been farming through were now designated as a protected area. So they weren't actually legally meant to be going back into those landscapes to burn. So it was helping them move to a different sort of farming.
Thanks, Laura. That's really helpful to hear about your vast experience in agriculture and also the work that you've done with farmers. But what we're seeing today is that nearly 2/3 of the big agri-food firms are referring to regenerative agriculture. So can you explain to us, what is it? Is it just a buzzword? Is it a slightly more fundamental rethink of the sector?
So I think it's fundamentally more sort of repositioning of the sector in terms of really what was considered fringe forms of agriculture after the Second World War becoming mainstream. And I think that was primarily because farmers were experiencing soil degradation and depletion, which impacts yields and overall farm profits. And there was also a massive drive to reduce the carbon footprint of the agriculture sector. And this laid the stage perfectly for, regenerative agriculture to move into the spotlight. In its soil is really central to regenerative agriculture. And you can think of regenerative agriculture in its simplest form as meaning to put back more than you take. And that's what farmers are trying to do by building up their soils through processes that support soil health. So if you think about holding soil in your hands, you want it to be full of life. You want to actually be able to see the creatures within that soil or the worms, and you don't want it to be dry and hard and with no life, which would, indicate that it's highly compacted. Regenerative agriculture is also just so much more than soil, but I tend to think of it as that's the sort of the central starting point for regenerative agriculture. And At present, I would say there's no one universally agreed definition, and this has been a factor in the increase in the use of this term. And personally, I've spent decades discussing and looking for a definition of what would be considered sustainable agriculture, because this was the common term that was used by companies to describe a whole range of practices that they were doing. They would all claim to be doing sustainable agriculture, but there was no agreed definition of that. So I see regenerative farming as the closest thing at present that we have to moving towards a definition of what would be considered sort of sustainable agriculture. But again, it has become a catch-all term for a range of different practices that have been taking place in parallel for years under different frameworks, such as, it's been termed conservation agriculture and the practices around that, or climate smart agriculture, and centrally as well, organic agriculture, because regenerative agriculture came out of the organic movement. And Robert Rodell, he has a really nice definition of that basically talks about, ensuring it has high levels of built-in economic and biological stability. So it's also thinking about the economics of the farm, and it has to work for the farmer as well as that sort of economic and biological stability. And again, having minimal impacts on the environment beyond the farm or the field boundaries. So the fact that there is no universal approach has encouraged its uptake, and it does mean that as a practice it needs to be tailored to the farming system and the climatic environment that are there. So you have to think about, what's your rainfall, what's your temperature fluctuation, obviously your soil type, what the farmer currently does, what systems he can get access to, and then also individual preference for the farmer. And all of that needs to be incorporated before a farmer would move to thinking about looking at regenerative agricultural systems. And this lack of definition, even though it's sort of a stimulated uptake, it's also has challenges, because now there are fears associated with sort of the greenwashing of the use of this term. But overall, I'd say it's really exciting to see such a shift in the whole agricultural movement towards this topic. And it's wonderful to see soil becoming so central in conversations with corporates. And it's, all over their website. And sort of 10, 15 years ago, companies weren't talking about soil health so very visibly. But now you'll find lots of wonderful case studies about all the work they're doing on soil. So I think that in and of itself is an exciting change within the sector.
So we'll get a little bit to those case studies in a minute, but I was just thinking about, what does regenerative agriculture look like in practice for big companies? And at Kronos, we've been working with Brunel Pension Partnership to engage with those big food and beverage companies on climate physical risk and how biodiversity is used as part of their adaptation strategies. This is to encourage companies to assess and manage their physical risks and understand how companies are impacting biodiversity and managing biodiversity to mitigate climate impacts. Laura, you've very much been part of those dialogues with us as well. So can you tell the listeners how Regen Ag is playing out in those conversations with the corporates?
So I think it's really interesting that obviously we've been focusing with the food and drink sector. So you can see it coming out as sort of a central pillar in their targets and reporting. Primarily, I think it's being picked up around carbon reduction strategies, and then underlying that, it's to support sustainable supply chains. So the companies, they were looking at systems to reduce their carbon footprint, and then regenerative agriculture played really nicely into communicating all the different ways that that could happen within a farming system beyond the traditional carbon footprint, such as volume of nitrates used or the fuel used on the farm. So this provided a broader way to capture soil health and carbon around soil health. And then for the companies further down the supply chain, it's become a useful way to understand the sustainability of that supply chain and how resilient that supply chain is. So at the moment, I'd say it's sort of reflective of a broader trend within the companies, within the industry as a whole, and that we can still see within that there's a clear lack of definition around what regenerative agriculture is and the measurement of that and how it's being integrated into approaches. So there's a whole range of different ways that companies are discussing it, measuring it and defining it. And that shifts to where they are in the world and the cropping systems they have and the main commodities that they're buying. We've also seen that there's a real shortage of case studies at the moment demonstrating the benefits of regenerative agriculture for farmer resilience, because our focus has really been looking at, well, how does this make a farm more resilient? How does it impact in terms of climate resilience? And that's not coming through yet. So I think as more and more farmers adopt this and more companies talk about this, more is being shared, but it would be great to see those case studies coming through to support farmer adoption and give other farmers and other companies the confidence to try and start on this journey. And we can see that companies are using it with farmers on sort of a gradual improvement basis, which is exactly, I think, where it needs to be. You know, it's a long journey. Companies are slowly supporting farmers, and there's a real recognition that there's, you know, varying expectations of different practices they can adopt and sort of different thresholds of when a farmer would be considered regenerative.
So you talk about companies and farmers being climate resilient. Can you give us an example of how regenerative agriculture helps with climate mitigation, but also climate adaptation?
Regenerative agriculture, it really plays in primarily to the whole mitigation piece, because it's a different range of measures that focus on soil management, which can then be linked to carbon measures. So that includes things like reduced tillage. So that's not ploughing as much or not ploughing as deeply. Cover cropping, so you would never have bare soil. That's one of the aims, that you would always, as soon as you've harvested, you would then put in a cover crop that hopefully would also capture nitrogen so that it's drawing down and improving soil health. If you've got highly compacted soils, you would want a cover crop that sends down really deep roots to help break that land up and the soil up to improve absorption of nutrients, but also crucially to improve water absorption so that you're reducing your runoff. So if you get heavy rains, the water stays in the soil for longer, which is hugely important for a farmer in terms of, particularly now as we're seeing cycles of extreme drought coming up. So anything that increases water absorption from the soils, great. But a key part of it is to use less synthetic inputs. So that's less synthetic fertilizers. Hopefully the long-term aim would be that you would move away completely from synthetic pesticides or fertilizers or herbicides. But a key part that a number of the companies are measuring is a reduction in nitrogen fertilizer, which obviously has a huge carbon footprint. So that's kind of the mitigation side of it. When you start looking at adaptation, again, it goes back to starting with that focus on the soil improvement. There's also things like crop diversification and crop rotation. And again, diversification helps with adaptation because that could be introducing a new crop to the farmer, which could be more tolerant during periods of drought, particularly following heavy rainfalls, or that the crop's able to withstand certain pests in a better way. So it's that overall resilience piece that's coming through in terms of the adaptation. And it's also could be seen as a mindset. The farmers who are adopting it are more, they're testing and trying new techniques. So it gives you a mindset towards adaptation, which will really support the farmers moving forward in terms of the unpredictability that's happening around climate and crop prices and commodity variations that we're seeing already playing out. So I think one thing that would also be nice to see is that the companies incorporating more adaptation practices, or even just communicating that they're doing some of the more sort of physical climate adaptation practices, such as testing different seed varieties and testing completely different crop for the farmer, and looking at larger landscape actions such as shade going into livestock systems. That would be thinking of introducing trees into a landscape. So you're providing natural cover for pigs or cows or chickens, so that those larger landscape pieces and that whole the element of biodiversity are also so central to regenerative agriculture.
So what does good practice actually look like for adaptation within regenerative agriculture? And are there any examples of companies that we can point to?
Yes, I think the good practice that was coming through is that you can see the companies are really offering a broad range of practices that farmers can adopt. So they're really cognizant of the fact that regenerative agriculture needs to be adapted to the farmer, and that they're the central starting point. It all starts with the farmer, right? Because it doesn't work if the farmer doesn't want to do this. And ultimately, they're the ones that are taking the risk in trying these different techniques. So we've seen a range of practices that are then being supported by the companies, where the farmers are picking and trialling. Maybe to begin with, they'll start with cover cropping, or they might want to do reduced tillage or increasing rotation. And the companies in general, I would say, are being pretty transparent in their reporting and how they're considering regenerative agriculture, and being clear that really the farmers just need to start adopting one or two practices and then helping them build over time. And companies like Nestle and Danone have really great examples of that. And then we're also seeing companies are incentivizing farmers to try new practices, either through, it might be a direct payment or an increase in pricing at point of contract, depending on what practice has been adopted and for how long. Other companies are looking for a mix of funding from philanthropic and government funding, which they then feed into as well. So it's looking for this blended finance mechanism to support farmers in terms of training and taking up these practices, because we have to think that this isn't going to happen overnight, and farmers need to be given the confidence and support to try new things and know that they're not going to be financially worse off, because there is a yield gap when you try. So someone needs to cover that. And we're seeing that some of the best companies are really looking at how to support farmers on that process.
As always, Laura, there's always trade-offs and downsides when you introduce different practices into an existing system, particularly given the complexities and the interconnectedness of issues within a farming system. So what would you say the trade-offs are that need to be considered when we're thinking about regenerative agriculture?
So in terms of trade-offs, there's sort of trade-offs at multiple levels, sort of from the farm level to a regional level, national trade-offs, and then there are also global food system trade-offs. But if we think about it at the farm level first, in most cases, there is a gap in productivity for farmers, so effectively a yield gap, that the volume of food produced on a field most likely will drop for the first few years that these practices are adopted. And then you see it increasing again. And really, who pays for that? Because the farmers don't have that level of tolerance to be able to take on that risk that in adopting new practice, effectively their income will go down. But the thing that you are also seeing in regenerative agriculture, that the overall farm income may stabilise even if your income per field reduces, because you're using less pesticides, less herbicides, your overall inputs have decreased, even if you're not making enough money from that field in terms of your yield gap. So that then plays onto the broader national picture in terms of, well, if the UK is producing less wheat, where are we going to buy that wheat in? So that's sort of the broader policy, food policy piece. And part of this is triggered to changing the mindset for a number of farmers to start looking at overall farm incomes rather than yield per hectare. So that's a big shift. And obviously, farmers have to be convinced that it's the right thing for them to do. So they really need to hear from other farmers on what's working and what isn't. And for example, if you put in cover crops, you can then have an increase in pests. So you might have more slugs the following year, so the yield would go down. So then it's learning what to do once you suddenly put in a cover crop. How do you manage that increase in pests? And that could be, for example, that you might bring in more livestock to graze that, or like ducks or chickens. But lots of farmers don't have mobile units of animals that they can just move into a farming system to integrate livestock and poultry into these systems, which is so central to that soil health. So there needs to be sort of a regional shift in where our animals are and how we farm them. And for a lot of farmers, if they're focused potentially on arable or they're tree crop farmers, they won't be used to dealing with livestock in that way. So we need a whole generation of people to come through who have that skills and expertise to integrate that into the farming landscape. One of the big trade-offs that we're seeing is the use of herbicides and herbicide sprays. Because farmers aren't ploughing and they're direct sowing into the ground. So I'm talking now with arable systems, not tree crops or other farming systems. When you're not direct sowing, they're then having their cover crop that they've put on over winter, that they're meant to be direct tilling into or reduced tilling into, that what they'll do instead is they'll spray herbicide over that field to kill that cover crop and then direct sow through it to reduce competition. That isn't the aim of regenerative agriculture, but that is happening. And for example, I know Friends of the Earth have brought out a report, Friends of the Earth US, really concerned about seeing an increase in use of herbicides in no-till and low-till systems. So that is something that research is happening on, and that's a central block that needs to be overcome, because it can't be that we would reduce other chemicals, but we then end up just becoming over-reliant on herbicides. And we also know there's knock-on effects of herbicides to the environment as a whole. But if your whole aim is to try and restore the soil health and the biodiversity of that farm, that's a huge trade-off that the sector has to deal with.
Thanks, Laura. You've raised just so many issues in relation just to thinking about trade-offs in regenerative agriculture. And I think we could probably have a whole nother podcast on the food system and the role of regenerative agriculture in relation to, distribution and equity and all the issues at that sort of more macro scale as well. As we're kind of coming towards the end of the podcast, though, let's end on a positive note. What are you looking forward to, and what are you excited about seeing next within this movement?
For me, one of the most exciting and interesting things coming out of it is this whole piece around the development of integrated pest management plans, which are really central to regenerative agriculture. And effectively what that means is that farmers will develop a plan to slowly phase out over time their use of all their artificial and synthetic pesticides going into the farm. So you will gradually start to see a reduction in applications of pesticides. Generally, that will be of great benefit to all of us and to the whole farming system, because there is a growing body of evidence that is showing, for example, the sublethal effects of, for example, something like fungicide on honeybees and bumblebee health, where it impacts their gut flora, which then impacts their survival rates going into winter. And you can just think about that yourself as a human. If you're feeling run down and you've got an upset tummy and you're not eating as much, and it's quite easy to understand why we would start to see huge drops in insect numbers from the multiple applications of all these different chemicals within the landscape. So anything that reduces that use of pesticides going into the landscape has to be of great benefit to all of us, as well as the biodiversity of the farm. And if this stimulates farmers receiving the support to do that, and support from a whole range of different actors that currently aren't maybe central stage at the moment, that would be wonderful to see. And additional funding going in to support farmers to do that, and trialling of different techniques, and farmers can share how they're getting along. So I think that will be a really interesting area to monitor as a central proponent coming out of the uptake of regenerative agriculture, and probably one of the hardest pieces for farmers to adapt to, because the industry will need to be there to support them with those solutions. And obviously, coming from a conservation background, for me, one of the exciting pieces is just going to be seeing how biodiversity is integrated into the farming system. And by that, I mean sort of creating habitats within the farm where you increase your predator-prey areas, so that you're encouraging your natural predators into a landscape by providing the habitat for them. But it's again making sure that that doesn't take our most productive land out of food production, and that we are looking at the farm holistically, and then looking at the farm holistically within the wider landscape, because obviously farmers can't just be expected to create every single habitat within their farm. That has to be generated through the wider landscape to support the full life cycle of the target species that we're looking at, and how farmers can think about using biodiversity to support the resilience of their farm. So, and again, part of that's going to be sort of things like taking a nature-based solutions lens on the whole farming system to diversify the income for the farmers, including things like integrating tree planting into grazing systems, for example, and how that can generate carbon and biodiversity credits for the farmer. So it's that lens of the farm as being part of the landscape and the farming system to support the biodiversity within that farm, but again, crucially, without affecting or taking our most productive land out of production.
Laura, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights. We've covered a lot today, from what we mean by regenerative agriculture to what good practice looks like and how companies are actually using regenerative agriculture for their adaptation and mitigation strategies. Obviously, there are trade-offs that come with this, but the benefits and the effectiveness is something that we hope will bring resilience to farmers and corporates at that farm landscape level, but also for the global food system as well. And for our listeners, do have a look at our website, www.kronossustainability.com, for more information on the work of our Biodiversity Nature team and other episodes of the Kronos Talks podcast. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn via the handle @KronosSustainability for all our news and updates. Thanks for listening.